Kate, your new book, One Life, is the story of your mother's life. When did you decide you wanted to write that story?
Well, after she died, I got out all her papers and I realised when I put them together there was a huge mass of information, wonderful memoirs about her life. So I thought I'd just make an assembly for the grandchildren, basically, you know, text and photographs. But the more I assembled, the more I realised that Mum's story, although unique and absolutely original, was also part of a wider story of women whose life spanned the 20th century. I began to see that her story was part of a sort of understanding of a part of our past that should have a wider readership than 5 grandchildren.
She was an ordinary woman, but she also had an extraordinary life in some interesting ways. Tell us briefly what she did.
Well, she was born into the rural working class in 1912, but by a stroke of luck, she trained as a pharmacist, and she then became, in effect, a career woman. She actually started her own pharmacy businesses twice, while at the same time running a household and bringing up 3 young children. And at that time, the first pharmacy was in 1946, the second was in 1953 or so. At that time, it was almost unheard of for a woman with young children not just to be working outside the home, that was unusual enough, but to be running her own businesses as a registered pharmacist.
How did she make it work?
With great difficulty. Both times, the pharmacies were, she often said to me, if the pharmacies had been less successful, I would have been able to manage. The main problem was lack of childcare. Because in those days, even though many women did work for all sorts of reasons, go out to work, I mean, that wasn't acknowledged. There were no arrangements made for them. It was as if none of them did. So they had to make improvised arrangements with their mothers or a neighbour woman who might look after them. So in each case, Mum eventually had to abandon her businesses because her children were too young.
What lessons did you learn from her life that have influenced you?
Not to give up. The fact that life will knock you down, but when it does, you just get up again and you have another go. You might come at the thing from a different angle. Not to wallow in self-pity, no matter how bad things are. Wallow for a little while, but, you know, get over it. That a woman, she said to me once, you know, a woman can do everything, just not all at the same time. And that was a good lesson for me, because part of the thing about her story is the problems she faced as a woman trying to juggle family and career were different from the ones we have to juggle today, but not all that different. It's a little bit easier for us, but we are still divided between those 2 parts of ourselves, the one that wants to be a good parent and a good wife, and the one that wants to have an existence out in the world.
How have you made it work?
Well, again, with some difficulty, but it's much easier for me. She was an enormous support. She did help me with the kids. And her model told me that you just had to cobble things together as well as you could to make things happen. I was also very lucky with a very good husband. And I had the benefit of, you know, organised childcare and all those things. I think I was very, very blessed. And I often think if Mum had had those advantages, she might have done even more than she did.
She might have been a writer?
She might well have been a writer. She was a fabulous reader, and of course she did leave these bits of memoir, many of which start by saying something like, I have always wanted to write a book. Many other people do it. It can't be that hard. I've never had the right pencil, but it's time to get on with it. Something like that. So I think she probably was a writer, Monkey.
And even though she didn't finish a book herself, she did feed you a lot of the stories that have gone into your novels.
Yes. Look, I owe her everything, because the books that I'm most proud of having written, The Secret River, The Lieutenant and Sarah Thornhill, which are based on early Australian history, spring directly out of the stories she told me about our family history. And if she hadn't told me those, and told me them enough times for a bored child to finally twig that I must remember these, I would not have had those stories and not have realised how important they were. So she gave me many, many gifts, and that was one of the very great ones.
Do you think young people will get something from this?
Well, young people, I think, will look at it in amazement, as my own children did, to say it was this short a time ago that life was so primitive. Not only was there no internet, I mean, there were no phones, people didn't have cars, there was no social safety net of any kind. They will be amazed that it was the time of their grandparents, only that far back, that our lives, our society was completely different.
How would you describe this book? Is this a biography or a memoir?
Look, I think the academics and the critics will have to argue about it. It has elements of many things. It's obviously in some ways a biography. It's the true story of my mother's life from her birth till about 50 or so. In other ways, though, it's a biography in which I've allowed myself to use fictional devices. Obviously, I can't know exactly what people said to each other. I can't know what the weather was like, what she was wearing. Those sorts of things I've invented. I can't know exactly what it was like, for example, when she was taken home to meet her future husband's rather scary family. I have to imagine that from my own experience. So in that sense, you could say it's fiction. So I will leave the categorisation to others. What I think it is simply what you might call a book. It's an exploration of an individual human being whose life I hope will speak to other people.